I get a phone call and say, you need to check on your son. I think he just got shot. Once they came in and told me that my son didn't make it, that was it for me. I just broke down crying like I just couldn't stop.
The aunt brought forward the Facebook Live video showing that these are the two people that need to be looked at as far as killing her nephew.
Hey, look, this how many people I done shot at, bro. Look, this how many, look. I done shot so many people. Real talk, ho. We shooting grannies, cousins, uncles, all that, bitch.
She was claiming to be his Bonnie and calling him her Clyde.
I wasn't even trying to kill him. I didn't even know he was dead until she showed me.
He was like, we in this together, you ain't going nowhere, you can't never leave my side.
I am posting all this stuff on Facebook.
You talking about like why he posting saying we did?
Yeah.
I don't know, Hakeem is crazy.
My name is Hakeem Griffin White. I have a lot of regrets, like, I wish I could just take it all back.
My name is Ashley Coleman.
And with this show, what do you want us to say under your name?
A victim.
It's 2:40 p.m. on March 2nd, 2017. In the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, Texas, a flurry of calls flood 911 dispatchers.
Dallas 911.
Hi, someone just got shot in front of me.
Yeah, he shot. I can see blood coming from him.
Where is the person at, sir?
He's right here. He's in the street. On Bonneview and Sinushead.
Shots fired in Oak Cliff are definitely not uncommon. It's something that, unfortunately, residents in that area probably see or hear every day.
The Oak Cliff area is poverty-stricken. Gangs, different things, killings every day. You can say it's like any other hood or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
As a crowd gathers around the victim, a bystander pulls out their phone and starts recording.
Don't move. They say don't move him, man.
Y'all know who shot him?
No, he moving himself, though. Just breathe, baby. Just take it slow, baby. Try to get up.
Okay, I got somebody on the way.
All right.
When first responders arrived, they saw a young man in the street who had collapsed. He had been shot in broad daylight. He was in pretty bad shape. He had already lost a lot of blood.
The recording continues as EMTs fight to save the victim's life. As he's rushed to the hospital, the video is shared online, where he's identified as 19-year-old Drake Keaston Alex. The news quickly spreads throughout the community, including to Drake Keaston's mother a few miles away.
I get a phone call and say, you need to check on your son. I think he just got shot. And instantly, whatever I was doing, I stopped. I jump in the car. As I'm driving, I get a video online. It was him on a stretcher, and his hand was just, hanging from the stretcher. So I was like, Lord, I just started praying extra hard that he'd be okay.
He was shot in the left hip, and a major artery was hit and severed with that one shot. He had actually lost a lot of blood, and so he was dead on arrival by the time that his body made it to the hospital.
I headed to the hospital. Once they came in and told me that my son didn't make it, that was it for me. I just fall down to my knees because I knew my baby had been gone. And I just broke down crying like I just couldn't stop. To have to deal with that was the worst day of my life.
To his large and loving family, Dre Keyston Alex always held the title of entertainer.
It was never a dull moment with him. You can be having a bad day, and he coming in and he's gonna do something funny to where, you forget about what you was mad about. He was that type of person.
During high school, Dre's talent soared as a standout football player and a budding performer.
Dre was a great athlete, musically inclined, wanted to be a rapper.
He most definitely wanted to be a rapper. I didn't know half of the stuff they were saying. I enjoyed it. If that was what he wanted to do, that was what he wanted to do. I was going to support him.
With an athletic build and an outgoing personality, Dre was also popular with the ladies.
It was a smile for them. At least that's what he said. At least that's what he said, but he's most definitely a charming little fella.
A romance with Dre's high school sweetheart, Taz, paved the way to fatherhood for Dre in 2016. Less than a year later, Dre discovered they'd soon be welcoming a second child, but his relationship with Taz didn't last.
He was just going along in life, trying to be a successful parent, and Dre had a baby on the way. He was simply a young man trying to make it and trying to be there for his children.
He was a great father. He loved fatherhood. The little time that he did get, he loved it.
But just weeks before the birth of his second child, Dre's life is suddenly cut short when he's gunned down in the street by an unknown assailant on March 2nd, 2017.
I never pictured myself not making more memories with my child. I just couldn't believe it.
Within an hour of the shooting, Dallas detectives arrive on the scene.
In the totality of scenes that I've seen, this was actually a very minimal scene as far as evidence. We found 2 spent casings and 1 live one. So we were figuring 2 rounds shot, but we knew he was only hit once.
I don't know if the gun was perhaps jammed or what the problem is, and that could have been why the live round was there.
The main thing we know is, we need to collect those casings, and then we know what caliber weapon we're looking for. By the time we got there, there was only 1 or 2 witnesses, and then beyond that, there were some people that heard things, but nobody that really saw anything.
People, obviously, they heard the shots, but people are afraid to talk because when people are brazen to do something like that in broad daylight, what are they going to do to you? They don't want to be the next victim.
It did seem like he was kind of at the wrong place at the wrong time. With somebody having it out for him, though, he was the target. But over what?
Coming up, detectives uncover complicated relationships in their victim's life.
When they showed me who he was, I was like, wait a minute. I know him. I know him personally. I know this kid. I never even knew no animosity was between them two.
And a toxic romance will soon take center stage.
They both glorified negativity. And they were each other's hype man. They were hyping each other up.
Are they gonna go real Bonnie and Clyde and actually, not go down without a fight?
Dallas police detectives are searching for evidence that may lead them to a suspect in the shooting death of 19-year-old Dre Keyston Alex.
Because it was in the street, kind of near a shopping center and some other businesses, we were looking for cameras that would capture images of the offense.
While officers make their rounds to nearby establishments asking for footage that may have captured the shooting, detectives travel to the hospital to gather more information about Dre Keyston from his family members.
I got more background information from the family, which is really significant because it's what we call victimology, and it helps us have a baseline of where to start in an investigation. Dre's mother, she really wasn't able to communicate with me very much. It was just highly emotionally charged state, which I can't even imagine, losing a child. Her sister is the one that communicated with me.
Dre's aunt informs detectives that Dre had been on the way to see his former girlfriend Taz just before the shooting occurred.
I actually had talked to him earlier. He was with his sister. She was dropping him off.
Dre's sister says she dropped him off at a store on Sunnyvale, but insists there was nothing about the drop-off that led her to believe he was in any kind of trouble.
While I was at the hospital, there was also a girlfriend of Dre's named Ebony who was there, which is a different person from this other woman, Taz.
She said she was actually on the phone with the victim at the time of the shooting.
So he was going to see Taz, is my understanding, but Ebony's on the phone with him.
Romantic relationships, we look at those, we need to address it to figure out any possible animosity.
So I talked to Ebony. She showed me her phone log to show me what times they were on the phone. She stayed on the phone with him for about 4 minutes, and he did tell her on the phone where he was at. She heard him talking to some unknown person, and they were arguing, and it was a male voice.
Soon after that, she heard the gunshot, and then he went on the phone.
The phone hung up. She didn't know who he was arguing with, but that's the last time she heard from him.
When asked if she's aware that Dre was on his way to visit Taz at the time of his death, Ebony assures detectives that she was aware of their planned meeting.
Nobody had said anything about any hostility necessarily between family members or ex-girlfriends.
So you kind of go down the list of finding out what's your alibi, where were you that day, and then how can I prove that?
Before detectives can confirm Ebony's alibi, they get word that crucial evidence from the scene has just come in.
There were several businesses with cameras, so fortunately there was a camera right there that recorded everything. Having a complete picture is huge in any investigation.
The footage is really important. First of all, it shows the entire shooting, which is critical because it lays out for us how it happened.
It showed suspect pulling up, showed that there was a driver, showed that the shooter was the passenger. The passenger approached Dre as he's walking across the street.
Someone approaches him and apparently starts an argument.
The suspect pulled the gun out. You can see Dre then run off, and then you see the shooter even take time and aim for the follow-up shot. And then after the shooting, the driver waits for the shooter to get back into the vehicle, and then they leave together.
The driver appeared to be a black female, and we could tell the color of the clothing.
She had a beanie on with a little puffball on top. The shooter appeared to be a male, as you could tell, very thin build.
They couldn't identify the shooter, but they were able to see specific details about the getaway vehicle.
The surveillance video captured the red PT Cruiser, which is not like a really common car to have, and they kind of stand out.
Detectives are unable to read the license plate, so they turn to the public for help.
They were able to do some freeze frames of the footage for that vehicle and put it out in media, trying to get people to call in if they knew or had seen that particular vehicle.
This vehicle and the people inside of it are the suspects in this murder.
Detectives have uncovered surveillance footage of the exact moment 19-year-old Dre Keyston Alex was gunned down in Dallas, Texas, and of two suspects fleeing the crime scene.
This was a distinct vehicle, this reddish, maroonish PT Cruiser.
Whenever you have a vehicle like so specific like that, it really is a gift because there's only so many. And so I started going through every single report to look if they live in that area. Is there a black female driver or registered owner, perhaps? Like anything I can find that can tie me into the right direction.
Meanwhile, Dre's family discovers a crucial piece of evidence and immediately contacts detectives.
There was a social media video that was floating around.
The aunt brought forward the Facebook Live video showing that these are the two people that I think need to be looked at as far as killing her nephew.
Hey, look, this how many people I done shot at, bro. Look, this how many, look, I done shot so many people.
They were bragging about what they were going to do. They were going to do a shooting. They didn't say who they were going to shoot specifically.
Real talk, ho. We shooting grannies, cousins, uncles, all that, bitch.
The timestamp of this video is right before the shooting. Everything's just falling into place. The clothing matches what we see on the video of the offense. The vehicle, we believe that's the same vehicle. The interior matches what the inside of a PT Cruiser would be. There they are with the gun, and they're talking about, we're going to go out and we're going to kill people.
While Dre's family can't identify the woman in the video, they tell detectives that the man is 17-year-old Hakeem Griffin White.
When they showed me who he was, I was like, wait a minute. I know him. Like, I know him personally. I know this kid.
Growing up in Dallas's Oak Cliff neighborhood, Hakeem Griffin White was an introvert by nature.
Hakeem was real charming, but he was quiet for the most part. He was someone that you were okay with having around, meaning he doesn't come with drama.
I met him while he was young. He didn't talk too much, but every time I would see him, I would have conversations with him. He was a calm, just cool kid.
At a young age, Hakeem met Dre Keaston, and the two became fast friends.
They was always playing outside, football, running in the street, dancing, in the house playing the video game, waiting for me to finish cooking, watching movies. Like normal kids. Normal kids. We moved away and they went there, we went here. That's it. Well, now everybody is up in age, high school, doing their own thing. So I haven't seen them since, they was all young kids.
Detectives learned that Dre Keaston and Hakeem's friendship had deteriorated as teenagers.
I don't know the incident or what drama took place for them to not become friends. The only thing that I do remember is whenever Dre did come around, he was always trying to fight Hakeem.
You would have never known they were cool before that.
The rumor was that this was this long-standing beef, and that's kind of how these feuds sometimes linger. Someone's going to retaliate until they're the bigger person or they're the winner. Hakeem fit the physical descriptions of the shooter. Now there's this video that was going around on Facebook.
Detectives are stunned as the video of Hakeem goes viral.
Social media has really changed the landscape of law enforcement. It can be very beneficial, but it's also another layer to dig through.
Searching social media, detectives identify the woman in the video as a local Dallas rapper named Mommy Cash.
You gon' around and get gang bang. Let me tell you about the style hoe. Think she really poppin', but she not though.
When we start going through social media, we start looking for other things through some of your posts, maybe somebody else's post to your page. There were quite a few people that knew her as Ashley. Fortunately, there were references to her birthday on there. We were able to take the name Ashley and cross-reference that with the birthday and came up with her true name of Ashley Coleman.
The interesting thing I found out about Ashley is that she was 27. She was quite a bit older than Hakeem, who was 17. There was kind of a sense of okay, they've already done this in broad daylight. They weren't wearing masks when they did it. The vehicle's on video. Are they going to go real Bonnie and Clyde and actually, like, not go down without a fight?
Hours into the murder investigation of Drakeist and Alex, detectives in Dallas, Texas are searching for two suspects after a viral video appears to show a local rapper named Ashley Coleman and Drakeiston's former friend Hakeem Griffin White making threats moments before the shooting.
It all started coming together. We found out Ashley has a red PT Cruiser. And at that point, it's almost too good to be true that you have video, you have her as a registered owner, and they fit the physical descriptions of the suspects.
Authorities continue to monitor social media, searching for any clues as to where Ashley and Hakeem might be hiding out. To their surprise, they're both actively posting.
Ashley went on social media saying, "That's not my car. My car looks different." And Hakeem was saying, "That's not me. That's a different person." So they knew that they had been caught on camera.
They're trying to appeal to the masses that they're innocent. So they're going to go back and try to undo the damage they've done.
Ashley is on social media lamenting that I'm not a killer. I just do that just for social media. I just do that for my persona, for my image.
Detectives escalate their efforts to locate Ashley and Hakeem.
We're doing research for places she might be staying. So we do surveillance, and the next day, we end up finding the PT Cruiser at another family member's house.
They see that the red PT Cruiser is there. And then this U-Haul truck pulls up. Then they see Ashley come out of the house.
Ashley's trying to move out. You know, she's hired someone in a U-Haul truck to move. And so she's saying she's innocent, but she's already on the lam, so to speak.
We still hadn't seen Hakeem at this point. We just saw the other individual in the U-Haul.
As authorities keep watch for Hakeem, Ashley suddenly gets in her PT Cruiser and drives away, followed by the moving truck.
So they follow her in this U-Haul.
But the U-Haul truck obstructs their view and they lose the car.
We end up losing the PT Cruiser just because it can move a little bit easier than the U-Haul, and we were able to stay on the U-Haul pretty well.
They pull the U-Haul over. When you pull over someone who's aiding and abetting a murder in their getaway, you of course, the natural thing is you think they're part of it as well.
But the driver insists he doesn't know Ashley or anything about where she might be headed. He claims he was hired by Ashley and an unidentified man the previous day.
He says they just picked me up at the shelter to help him move and drive this U-Haul. But while we're working on that, the surveillance team ended up finding the PT Cruiser abandoned.
We got a runner. When someone flees, you lose evidence. You're going to lose cell phones. You're going to lose possibly the gun. You could lose the clothing they were wearing.
While the authorities put out a bolo for the couple, detectives continue monitoring their social media for any indications about where they may have fled.
Throughout the next few days, they're continuing to post things on their social medias.
She was claiming to be his Bonnie and calling him her Clyde. To have these individuals who were really just so hell-bent on being bad and on just putting images out there that were bad was jarring.
I look my old out there. He running my name, skinning my name. Bitch, I'ma shoot you in your leg. Huh?
After seeking leads for 3 days, police hit pay dirt on March 5th.
We have a really good surveillance team that's really good at staying on the trail and talking to snitches and things like that, and developing information about where people might be hiding. And they eventually find them in a hotel just outside of town. So we set up surveillance.
Dallas authorities are on the hunt for 27-year-old Ashley Coleman and 17-year-old Hakeem Griffin White as their primary suspects in the death of 19-year-old Drakeiston Alex when they locate them in a Dallas area hotel.
We get the search warrant. We arrest Hakeem and Ashley.
They don't put up much of a fight when they're caught. They are apprehended with no combativeness. They are taken into custody.
For you to just take somebody's life and not have a care in the world, like, you don't need to be on the streets at all. It was a relief for me. You know, it was gonna bring my baby back. But to know that y'all have been gotten was a big relief for me.
Detectives bring Ashley in for questioning and begin learning more about the aspiring rapper.
Ready to get this over with?
My name is Ashley Coleman.
And with this show, what do you want us to say under your name? What your title is?
Victim.
Well, the victim.
Of course, defendant.
Ashley Ann Coleman had a rough start in life in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, Texas.
My experiences as a child, not having enough, not having new shoes, not having clothes, my mom having to go to pantries and people having to donate stuff from the churches and stuff. It taught me that if somebody could do it for me and make our day and we not ever knew it, that I can do it for them.
Without the resources to provide for herself, Ashley's early attempts to help others often led to petty crimes.
I don't care if you're homeless, if you're needy, if you just don't have it right then. I would do whatever. I would steal that stuff. It's cold outside. They need gloves. They need beanies. They need socks. So if I knew it was a store down the street, I did what I did. It became a habit.
In 2015, Ashley created her alter ego, Mommy Cash.
Mama Cash, she was dope. She was dope. And at that time, it wasn't that many female artists, so, you know, it was something different.
You Mommy Cash now. You Cash team.
My dreams and my goals with my music were to show like the kids from my neighborhood and every other neighborhood that's been down bad that like you can make it.
But success in the rap game proved to be harder than Ashley anticipated.
Women trying to be in the industry is hard for us, you know. It's not easy trying to be something that nobody believes you can be.
Just when Ashley was starting to lose hope in her chosen career path, she met 17-year-old Hakeem Griffin White.
Hakeem was a fan. He followed Ashley on social media. He was in her DMs. He was someone who showed up to her performances.
Hakeem was very charming. He was sweet. He told me all the things I don't really hear. You know, you feel like you don't have something or not enough of something. And he made me feel like I had it all. I felt as if I had it and I could do anything. He would go with me to my shows, go with me to the studios, and it was different having someone around that could be there. He said he wouldn't let anything happen to me. You know, I felt safe and confident.
My name is Hakeem Griffin White. Me and Ashley had met through Facebook. You know what I'm saying? Like, I had seen her before already, like, cause she was doing her little music videos and things, so I already knew of her. So when I seen her, I was like, okay, she trying to do something in life. I learned in the industry, like, you have to have some type of, like, facade so people won't just attack you or something like that. Like, people want to see that gangster.
They both glorified negativity. They were hyping each other up.
With the couple now in custody, detectives confront Ashley about Dre Keaston's murder, and she points the finger squarely at Hakeem.
I ain't shoot nobody. I didn't know what was going on. I can't control another person.
Why y'all posting all this stuff on Facebook?
What? Like what?
Everything.
Oh, he posted it. That Hunter knew me. You talking about like why he posting saying what he did?
Yeah.
I don't know. Hakeem is crazy.
He's a charmer. Don't get on his bad side. Don't press that button. Don't poke. Don't ask too much. And the less you say, the better.
He was very abusive. I needed to get away from him, and I just didn't want his family or nobody to hurt my family.
The week of the murder, Hakeem started playing these games with me, threatening to call the police if I left. He started lashing out, having angry spells, acting crazy. I was scared. I feel like he gonna do something to, hurt me.
It wasn't none of that going on. Like, why would you be with somebody that's just gonna beat you up all the time? Like, that's not my character.
My mom, my sister tell me, you gotta turn him in. But I'm like looking at my mom like, it's not so simple.
We were like, we in this together. You ain't going nowhere. You can't never leave my side.
None of that story really made sense based on, it's her social media that they're putting all this stuff on. Everything about her demeanor was just very manipulative throughout my entire interaction with her. She was ready to throw him under the bus as soon as she could.
If I would have known what I know now, man, think about Ashley, she's just a hard pill to swallow. The thing she was saying to me, I don't know why she's saying it about me, because that's just not me.
Coming up, Hakeem Griffin White recounts his side of the story.
Like one day he was just like, I'm gonna get you. I'm you know what I'm saying? I'm terrified.
I just want to know why. What did he do that bad for you to take his life?
Under the pressure of police interrogation, Ashley Coleman tries to distance herself from the murder of Dre Keaston Alex, claiming her boyfriend and the alleged trigger man, Hakeem Griffin White, was actually her abuser.
He already had beat me up previously, so I was kind of scared.
I feel like she could have stopped it, but that never happened. Instead, it was encouraging.
I never encouraged Hakeem to do anything. Everything that he's done willingly, knowingly, and because he wanted to.
In another interrogation room, Hakeem opens up to detectives about his and Ashley's social media personas and the video they created on the day Dre Keaston was shot.
I went live and I was just splashing on there, acting hard. I ain't gonna even lie. Just to act hard for Facebook, bro. That's why. This the thing about that video. That video had to do with this man. Nowhere in that video it say this man's name. Nowhere. I ain't even was thinking about this dude ever until I seen him that day.
Hakeem tells us that they just rolled up on this guy that he's been having this several years long dispute with.
We had a lot of little ups and downs. That's part of friendship with certain people.
He said he had this ongoing dispute with Dre for years. School stuff where they just, for whatever reason, they didn't get along, and it just, over the years, escalated.
One day he was just like, I'm gonna get you. I'm you know what I'm saying? I'm terrified.
Hakeem claims the feud came to a head several months earlier when Dre Keaston threatened him outside a family member's house.
I just remember him taking a gun out, and I was just sitting there looking up to a gun dang, I'm really finna die right now. This stuff crazy. So, long story short, some lady came out with her kids in the apartments, and she must have like looked our way. So as it being witnesses, he just ended up turning away. That right there was just like, dang, like that was just foul play. I wasn't digging it. I feel like my life was being just too much in danger. Like, I want this dude to stop messing with me, man.
Hakeem admits when he happened to see Dre Keyston on the morning of March 2nd, he took the opportunity to teach his former friend a lesson.
I ended up seeing Dre coming my way with his hands in his pants on the phone. So I was like, she don't know, dude. Ashley didn't know like the beef me and him had over all this time. So she don't really know what was going on. I just ended up reacting towards it like real fast. Like, I was just letting him know, like, bro, you ain't finna keep doing me like that, bro. You know what I'm saying? Like, you ain't finna keep on trying to come for me, try to kill me. My mental went to straight, like, just to scare him. I had shot. You know what I'm saying? It was like a quick shot. And then, boom, I ended up taking out running towards the car. So when I hopped in the car, we burned out. I wasn't even trying to kill him. I didn't even know he was dead until she showed me. I thought he was still alive.
Throughout the interrogation, Hakeem attempts to shield Ashley from any responsibility. Still, authorities charge both Hakeem Griffin White and Ashley Coleman with first-degree murder.
In Texas, we have the law of parties, which means that the driver and the shooter both go down for the same thing. It doesn't matter that you didn't pull the trigger. It doesn't matter that it wasn't your idea. If you played a role in that crime, you go down for that crime too.
I didn't understand why. You know, I felt like I was a victim myself, so why am I being charged with what he did, you know?
There definitely is a level of premeditation. In that Facebook Live video, you see Ashley and Hakeem in the car. They're holding up a gun, they're holding up a magazine, they're showing bullets. Kind of talking smack about what they're gonna do.
We've got this video, the clothing matches. This video, the weapon matches the casings that were recovered in the scene. All of it matched perfectly throughout the whole thing.
In March of 2019, 2 years after Dre's murder, Hakeem heads to trial.
Trial was really hard because you got people in this world doing very, very bad things, like, and I accidentally shot a person, like, this was really like accidental, so it was like how y'all just gonna do me like this?
When you have surveillance video, it's hard to argue self-defense. It's hard to argue something else when it's right there in front of you that you gunned down this person and you were doing it on purpose.
You shot him once. You tried to shoot him again, but your gun jammed. So your intention was most definitely to kill my son.
This was not an accident. This was a very intentional act.
Hakeem Griffin White is ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and is sentenced to 75 years in prison.
I'm not gonna say I was satisfied, but I really think that you take a life, you get a life.
Worried she will face the same fate, Ashley decides to strike a deal with prosecutors. On September 24th, 2019, she pleads guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a reduced 19-year prison sentence.
That hurt me to my core because why should she be able to get a plea deal and she just as guilty as he is? You know right from wrong. You knew what he was doing wasn't right. But I'm okay because y'all not out here. And you get to get punished for something that you did.
Unfortunately, someone lost their life as a result of their persona becoming bigger than the image that they were putting out. They chose to be realistic with it. They chose to show the world that it wasn't just what you saw on social media. They wanted to live it out, and they did.
I did love Hakeem because he needed love, and he wanted love, and I believe everybody should be loved. At the same time, it's what you did with my love that totally took me for a loop.
When I was hearing all this verbal abuse or physical abuse, like, I'm not abusive, like, that's just not me. I have a lot of regrets, like, even ever touching a gun, that's a regret. Dealing with Ashley, that's another regret. A lot of things in life that I just regret, I wish I could just take it all back.
Your parents can still come and see y'all. Y'all are able to talk. You're eating, you're living. Regardless if it's behind the boys or not, I have to go to a gravesite and talk to dirt, a headstone, no voices. It's not a day that go by that I don't talk about him. I post his pictures and everything on social media. It's never going to be easy, but it is going to be okay.
A voice in the dark in the late hours of a quiet night in Melbourne, when suburban streets had long since emptied and the ordinary rhythms of family life had settled into sleep. There was a kind of silence that people trusted. It was the silence of locked doors, of drawn curtains, of routines repeated so often that they no longer required thought. Inside those homes, children slept in their beds, parents lay only a few walls away, and the idea of danger felt distant, something that belonged elsewhere, to other places, to other lives. But in a series of nights that would come to define one of the most haunting criminal investigations in Australian history, that silence was not empty. It was occupied. Somewhere inside one of those homes, a man stood already present, already in control, already waiting. He did not crash through windows or force his way in with noise and urgency. There was no chaotic struggle, no raised voice that might shatter the stillness. Instead, there was precision, a calculated intrusion that began not with violence, but with presence. By the time the families became aware that something was wrong, it was already too late. He was inside, he was watching, and he had a plan. The man who would later be known only as Mr. Cruel did not earn that name because he was unpredictable or impulsive. Quite the opposite. What set him apart, what made him so deeply unsettling, was the methodical calm with which he operated. Survivors would later describe a voice that did not shout, did not tremble, did not betray panic or haste. It was controlled, almost measured, as though each word had been considered in advance. In the context of what he was doing, that calmness became something far more disturbing than rage. It suggested not a loss of control, but absolute control. In those moments, inside homes that had once felt safe, he dictated every movement. Parents were restrained, rendered helpless not only by physical force, but by the knowledge that any resistance might bring harm to their child. And then, with a deliberate focus that seemed rehearsed, he would separate one victim from the rest. The boundaries of the home, the very structure meant to protect, became meaningless. Rooms that had once held comfort were transformed into spaces of isolation and fear. There was no randomness in his actions. Every detail, every step carried the impression of preparation. He concealed his identity, wore gloves, avoided leaving traces. He did not linger unnecessarily, and yet he did not rush. Time, in his presence, seemed to follow his rules. In later accounts, one of the most chilling elements would not be what he did, but how he did it. Victims described behavior that felt contradictory, even surreal. A man committing calculated acts of harm, yet speaking in a tone that was calm, almost polite. A figure who maintained control not through chaos, but through quiet authority. It created a dissonance that made the experience harder to process, harder to place within any familiar understanding of danger. This was not the image of violence people expected. It was something colder, more deliberate, and far more difficult to anticipate. Over time, as more incidents emerged, the pattern began to take shape. Different homes, similar methods. Different families, the same intrusion into their most private spaces. The realization that these events were connected transformed isolated fear into something broader, something shared. Across Melbourne, a question began to take hold, unspoken at first, then unavoidable. If it could happen in one home, why not another? If one family could be targeted, why not yours? The name Mr. Cruel would come later, assigned by the media as a way to contain something that resisted understanding. It was a label, but it was also an admission that there was no face to attach, no identity to confront, just a pattern of behavior, a series of acts, and a presence that seemed to move through the city without leaving a trace. The name itself carried a kind of blunt simplicity, as if reducing the unknown to two words might make it easier to grasp. But nothing about the case was simple, because behind that name was not just cruelty, but control, planning, and an absence of mistakes that would frustrate investigators for years. What made the situation even more unsettling was what could not be seen. There were no witnesses who could identify him, no clear forensic evidence that could anchor the investigation. He anticipated the methods used to catch offenders and worked deliberately to avoid them. Gloves ensured no fingerprints. A mask concealed his face. The scenes he left behind offered little for investigators to build on. It was as though he understood the system he was operating within and knew exactly how to stay one step ahead of it. As the timeline stretched from 1987 to 1991, each new development deepened the sense of unease. This was not a single event, not an isolated act. It was a sequence, a progression, and with each step, the stakes grew higher. The pattern suggested not only repetition, but evolution. A man who was not only capable of committing these acts, but of refining them, learning, adapting, becoming more confident in his ability to remain unseen. And yet, for all the fear he created, he remained intangible. There was no confrontation, no moment where he was forced into the light. Instead, he existed in the margins, in the gaps between what was known and what could be proven. For the families affected, the impact was immediate and personal. For the broader community, it was something more diffuse, but no less powerful. A shift in perception, the realization that safety was not guaranteed, that the ordinary could be interrupted without warning. Doors were checked more carefully. Windows were secured. But beneath those actions was a deeper uncertainty, one that could not be locked out. Because the threat they faced was not defined by force alone, but by patience and planning. By someone who chose his moments carefully, who observed before he acted, who understood that the most effective way to enter a home was not always through breaking in, but through knowing exactly when and how to do so without being noticed. The story of Mr. Cruel does not begin with a single dramatic event. It begins with a quiet presence, a control voice, and a series of nights that unfolded in ways no one could have predicted. It is a story not only about the acts themselves, but about the absence of answers that followed. About an investigation that would search for a man who left almost nothing behind. And about a city that would come to understand that the most unsettling threats are not always the loudest ones, but the ones that move in silence, that act with intention, and that disappear before anyone can fully comprehend what has happened. Even now, the questions remain. Who was he? How did he manage to operate for so long without being identified? And perhaps most unsettling of all, how close did he come to being seen, to being caught, to being known? In the darkness of those suburban nights, the answers were never found. And in that absence, the story continues. a city that felt safe in the late 1980s. Life in Melbourne carried with it a quiet predictability that many families depended on. Suburban neighborhoods stretched outward in orderly patterns, lined with detached homes, small gardens, and streets that grew still after nightfall. These are not places people associated with danger. They were environments shaped by routine, children leaving for school in the morning, parents returning from work in the evening, doors closing, lights dimming, and the expectation that what lay inside those homes would remain undisturbed. Safety was not something constantly questioned. It was assumed. And it was precisely within that assumption that the events surrounding Mr. Cruel would leave their deepest impact. The victims in these cases were not chosen at random in the sense of chaos, but they shared defining characteristics that, when viewed together, revealed a disturbing consistency. They were young girls between the ages of 10 and 13, living within family homes, surrounded by parents or siblings who, under ordinary circumstances, would have been their first line of protection. This detail alone altered the psychological weight of the crimes. The attacks did not occur in isolated public spaces or under conditions that might be explained away as risk-taking or chance. They occurred inside the home, in bedrooms and hallways that represented familiarity and security. The victims were taken not from the margins of safety, but from its very center. To understand the full weight of these crimes, it is necessary to consider not only what happened, but where and to whom it happened. In 1987, in the suburb of Lower Plenty, the first known victim was an 11-year-old girl. Her life, like many children her age, would have been defined by ordinary routines, school days, family time, the gradual navigation of childhood. There is nothing in the available record to distinguish her from countless others. And that is precisely the point. She was not selected because she stood out, but because she fit a pattern that only the offender fully understood. On the night of the attack, her parents were present in the home. They were not absent or unaware of her existence. And yet, despite that proximity, they were rendered powerless, restrained, unable to intervene, forced to witness a situation in which their role as protectors was stripped away. For the victim, the experience was one of isolation within proximity, separated from her family not by distance, but by control imposed from outside. This dynamic would repeat itself in later cases, reinforcing a pattern that was as psychological as it was physical. In 1988, in the suburb of Ringwood, a 10-year-old girl became the next known victim. Like the first, she was taken from her home, from a space defined by familiarity. The circumstances again involved the presence of her family, and again, that presence did not prevent the crime. What distinguishes this case is the account provided by the victim after her release. Her description of the offender introduced a detail that would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case. His demeanor. He was not described as chaotic or overtly aggressive in his communication. Instead, he was calm, controlled, even described as strangely polite. This characterization complicates the way in which the crimes are understood. It suggests a deliberate choice in how he interacted with his victims. A controlled presentation that may have been intended to maintain dominance without escalating visible panic. The victim also described being given food, being allowed to bathe, and being provided with clean clothing. These actions, while not mitigating the nature of the crime, added a layer of contradiction that made the offender more difficult to categorize. He did not fit neatly into a single behavioral profile. Instead, he operated in a space that combined calculated harm with controlled, almost procedural interactions. Later that same year, in Don Vale, another 10-year-old girl, Sharon Wills, was taken under similar circumstances. Her case would become one of the most widely discussed, not because it differed dramatically in structure, but because it provided further insight into the offender's methods. Once again, the crime occurred at night. Once again, the family was present and restrained. And once again, the victim was removed from the home and held for a period of time before being released. During her captivity, Sharon Wills reported being fed, being allowed to bathe, and notably, having her voice recorded by the offender. This detail introduced a new dimension to the case. It suggested not only preparation, but intention beyond the immediate act. The recording of a victim's voice is not incidental. It requires equipment, planning, and a purpose that was never fully understood. It reinforced the idea that the offender was not acting impulsively, but following a structured approach that incorporated multiple steps, each carried out with care. The environment in which she was held also implied a level of preparation that went beyond temporary concealment. While specific details remained limited, the overall impression was of a controlled space, one that had been arranged in advance to facilitate the offender's actions while minimizing risk of detection. The victim's experiences, when placed side by side, reveal a pattern that extends beyond the surface similarities of age and circumstance. They highlight a consistent method of control, a repeated intrusion into the private sphere of the home, and a deliberate effort to manage both the physical and psychological dimensions of the crime. The offender did not rely solely on force. He relied on structure, on predictability within his own actions, even as he disrupted the predictability of his victims' lives. This combination made his behavior particularly difficult to anticipate or counter. In 1991, the pattern reached a point of escalation with the case of Carmine Chon, a 13-year-old girl taken from her home in Templestowe. Like the others, she was within the age range that had come to define the offender's victims. Like the others, she was taken from a domestic setting with her family nearby. But in this instance, the outcome was different. Following her abduction, a ransom demand was made, introducing an element that had not been clearly present in earlier cases. This shift suggested either a change in motive, an adaptation in approach, or a combination of both. The eventual discovery of her body marked the only confirmed killing within the series, but its significance extended far beyond that single fact. It represented a turning point, a moment at which the pattern that had previously ended with release instead concluded with death. For the community, this was not simply another incident. It was an escalation that intensified fear and underscored the potential for further harm. For investigators, it introduced new urgency, but also new complexity, as the case now encompassed both abduction and homicide within a framework that remained resistant to resolution. The victims, taken together, form the core of the story, not as abstract figures within a sequence of crimes, but as individuals whose experiences reveal the human impact of the offender's actions. There were children living within environments that were supposed to protect them, surrounded by families who, in those critical moments, were unable to intervene. Their accounts, where available, provide the most direct insight into the behavior of the offender. Yet even these accounts leave significant gaps. They describe what was seen, what was heard, what was experienced, but not who he was. This absence of identity is one of the defining features of the case. It shifts the focus from a known individual to a set of actions, a pattern without a face. And in that absence, the victim's experiences carry even greater weight, because they are among the few points of clarity in a narrative otherwise defined by uncertainty. Beyond the immediate experiences of the victims, the broader context of these events shaped how they were understood and remembered. The fact that the crimes occurred in suburban homes, in areas not typically associated with high levels of violent crime, amplified their impact. It challenged assumptions about safety, about predictability, about the idea that certain environments could be relied upon to provide protection. The offender's ability to enter these spaces, to control entire households, and to leave without being identified, suggested a level of capability that extended beyond the individual incidents. It implied knowledge of routines, of environments, of how to navigate spaces without drawing attention. And it raised questions that extended beyond the specifics of any single case. How were the victims chosen? How much had he observed before acting? And how many times had he come close to being seen, to being interrupted, without anyone realizing it? In examining the victims and the context in which these crimes occurred, it becomes clear that the story is not only about what happened, but about what was disrupted. The sense of safety that defined these communities was not simply shaken. It was fundamentally altered. Homes that had once represented security became sites of vulnerability. Routines that had once provided structure became points of exposure. And for the families involved, the impact was not confined to a single night, but extended into the years that followed, shaping how they understood risk, trust, and the boundaries of their own lives. The victims were at the center of this shift, not by choice, but by circumstance. And in telling their stories, even within the limits of available information, the focus remains where it belongs, not on the figure who caused the harm, but on those who experienced it, and on the broader environment that made those experiences all the more profound. For crimes, one pattern, the sequence of events attributed to the offender, known as Mr. Cruel, did not unfold as a single, easily contained episode, but as a series of incidents that, when viewed individually, were deeply disturbing, and when viewed together, revealed a pattern marked by consistency, control, and escalation. Each case followed a structure that appeared deliberate rather than spontaneous. And while there were variations in detail, the underlying method remained strikingly stable. The crimes began within the private boundaries of family homes and extended outward into carefully managed periods of captivity, before, in most cases, concluding with the release of the victim. It was a sequence that suggested not only planning, but repetition, an offender refining his approach over time, maintaining what worked, and adjusting what did not. The first known incident occurred in 1987 in the suburb of Lower Plenty. On the surface, it began as many such crimes do, during the night, when visibility was low and households were at their most vulnerable. But what distinguished this event was not simply the timing, but the manner of entry and control. The offender did not create a scene of forced chaos. Instead, he moved with purpose. By the time the family became aware of his presence, he had already established dominance over the situation. Armed with a knife, he restrained the parents, effectively neutralizing any immediate resistance. The presence of the weapon was not merely a threat, it was a tool of control, ensuring compliance without requiring overt physical violence. Once the adults were secured, his attention shifted to the 11-year-old girl in the home. The transition from controlling the family to isolating the child was executed without visible hesitation. The offender wore a mask, concealing his identity completely, and his communication remained calm, measured, and deliberate. There was no indication of panic, no rushed decisions. The act that followed occurred within the same home, in a space that had only moments before been part of a normal domestic environment. Afterward, the offender left without being apprehended, leaving behind a scene that, despite its severity, offered little in terms of immediate investigative leads. There were no clear signs of who he was, only the evidence of what he had done. Approximately a year later, in 1988, a second major incident took place in Ringwood. The similarities to the earlier case were difficult to ignore. Once again, the crime occurred at night. Once again, the offender entered a family home and quickly asserted control over the household. The parents were restrained, their ability to intervene removed almost immediately. But in this instance, the sequence extended beyond the boundaries of the home. The 10-year-old victim was not only isolated but abducted, taken from the environment in which the crime began to a separate, undisclosed location. This transition marked a significant development in the offender's method. It introduced a new layer of complexity, requiring transportation, concealment, and a controlled setting in which the victim could be held without detection. The duration of the captivity, approximately 18 hours, suggested that the offender had prepared in advance for this possibility. He did not release the victim immediately, nor did he act in a way that indicated improvisation. Instead, the time spent in captivity appeared structured. According to the victim's account, she was given food, allowed to bathe, and provided with clean clothing. These actions, while not diminishing the nature of the crime, reinforced the impression of a controlled environment. The offender maintained a level of order that extended beyond the initial act of abduction. His behavior remained consistent with earlier observations, calm, deliberate, and devoid of unnecessary escalation. When the period of captivity ended, the victim was released near her home, a decision that again suggested calculation. He did not abandon her in a distant or random location, but in a place where she could be found, where the immediate risk to her life was reduced. This pattern of abduction, followed by release, would continue in the next known case, further reinforcing the structure of his actions. Later, in 1988, in the suburb of Donvale, the offender carried out what would become one of the most widely recognized incidents in the series, involving 10-year-old Sharon Wills. By this point, the method had evolved into a sequence that combined elements of the earlier cases with additional layers of preparation. The initial entry into the home followed the established pattern: nighttime intrusion, rapid control of the family, and the use of restraints to prevent interference. The parents were again rendered powerless, and the victim was removed from the home. The period of captivity in this case lasted between 18 and 20 hours, consistent with the time frame observed in the previous abduction. However, certain details distinguished this incident and suggested a further refinement of the offender's approach. During her captivity, Sharon Wills reported being fed and allowed to bathe, maintaining the pattern of control care observed in the Ringwood case. But in addition to these actions, the offender recorded her voice. This detail introduced a new dimension, indicating that the offender was not only managing the immediate circumstances of the crime, but also engaging in behavior that extended beyond the basic requirements of control and concealment. The presence of recording equipment implied preparation, intention, and a willingness to incorporate additional elements into the process. It suggested that the location in which she was held was not temporary or improvised, but arranged in advance to accommodate these actions. While specific characteristics of the location were not fully detailed, the overall impression was of a space that had been deliberately prepared, possibly with considerations such as privacy and sound control. After the period of captivity, Sharon Wills was released in a public area, once again demonstrating the offender's pattern of returning victims rather than permanently removing them. This consistency in release, despite the severity of the crimes, became one of the defining features of the case until it changed. In 1991, after a gap of several years, the pattern took a decisive and irreversible turn with the abduction of 13-year-old Carmine Shawn from her home in Templestowe. The initial stages of the incident bore similarities to the earlier cases. The crime occurred at night within the family home and involved the removal of the victim from that environment. However, what followed diverged from the established pattern. In this case, a ransom demand was made, introducing a new element that had not been clearly present in the previous incidents. The demand suggested either a shift in motive or an expansion of the offender's objectives. It added a layer of complexity to the situation, as the crime now intersected with financial coercion in addition to abduction. Despite this development, the outcome did not align with the earlier pattern of release. Instead, the case concluded with the discovery of Carmine Chan's body in a remote area. This marked the only confirmed killing within the series and represented a significant escalation in the severity of the crimes. The transition from abduction and release to abduction and murder altered the trajectory of the case, both in terms of its impact on the community and its implications for the offender's behavior. It raised questions about what had changed during the intervening years, whether the offender's circumstances, intentions, or level of risk tolerance had shifted in a way that led to this outcome. Across these 4 incidents, the pattern that emerges is one of deliberate control, repeated structure, and eventual escalation. The offender demonstrated an ability to enter homes without detection, to manage multiple individuals within those homes, and to carry out a sequence of actions that extended beyond the initial intrusion. He maintained a consistent approach to concealment, using a mask to hide his identity and gloves to avoid leaving evidence. His communication remained calm, reinforcing his control over the situation. And in most cases, he concluded the sequence by releasing the victim, suggesting a defined endpoint to his actions. The final case disrupted that pattern, introducing an element of unpredictability that intensified the urgency of the investigation. Yet, even in that escalation, the underlying structure of his approach, planning, control, and avoidance of detection remained evident. The incidents, taken together, do not present a series of isolated crimes, but a progression. Each event builds on the previous one, reinforcing certain elements while introducing new variables. The consistency of the method suggests a level of experience and confidence, while the changes indicate adaptation. It is this combination that makes the series particularly challenging to interpret. The offender was not static, he evolved. And with that evolution came an increased capacity for harm, culminating in an outcome that differed fundamentally from what had come before. Chasing a ghost, as the incidents unfolded across the suburbs of Melbourne between 1987 and 1991, the task facing investigators grew steadily more complex. At first, each case presented itself as a deeply troubling but potentially isolated event, an intrusion into a private home, a controlled assault, a victim left behind with limited information, and a perpetrator who had already vanished. But as patterns began to emerge, the perspective shifted. What initially appeared as separate incidents gradually aligned into a sequence that demanded recognition as the work of a single offender. This realization marked the beginning of a coordinated investigative effort, one that would ultimately be defined not only by what was discovered, but by what remained out of reach. From the earliest stages, law enforcement was confronted with a fundamental challenge: the absence of usable evidence. The offender's methods suggested a deliberate awareness of forensic procedures, even within the technological limitations of the late 1980s. He wore a mask to conceal his identity, eliminating the possibility of facial recognition from victims. He used gloves, preventing the transfer of fingerprints. He controlled the environment in which the crimes took place, minimizing the chance of leaving behind trace evidence. These were not incidental precautions. They were integral to his approach. Each action appeared designed to reduce the risk of identification, to ensure that even after the crime had been committed, there would be little for investigators to work with. As additional cases were linked, the investigative strategy began to incorporate behavioral analysis. The consistency of the offender's actions provided a foundation for constructing a psychological profile. He was assessed as organized, methodical, and likely intelligent. The level of planning involved in each incident: entering homes undetected, restraining multiple individuals, abducting victims, and maintaining control over extended periods, suggested a capacity for detailed preparation. This was not a pattern of impulsive behavior. It reflected a structured approach, one that required foresight, discipline, and an ability to anticipate potential risks. Based on these observations, investigators considered the possibility that the offender held a profession that reinforced such traits. Fields such as engineering, education, or technical work were suggested, not as definitive answers, but as logical extensions of the behavior observed. The way he spoke to victims, calmly, without unnecessary aggression, also contributed to this assessment, indicating a level of interpersonal control that may have been developed through professional or social experience. Victim testimonies, limited though they were, became a critical component of the investigation. The descriptions provided were consistent in key respects, even if they lacked identifying detail. The offender's voice was described as controlled, measured, and, at times, polite, a characterization that stood in stark contrast to the nature of his actions. This contrast became a focal point in understanding his method of control, rather than relying solely on physical force. He appeared to use communication as a tool to maintain authority over the situation. By remaining calm, he reduced the likelihood of panic or resistance, creating an environment in which compliance was more easily achieved. This behavioral consistency reinforced the conclusion that the same individual was responsible for multiple incidents, strengthening the case for a single offender operating over an extended period. Despite these insights, the investigation remained constrained by the lack of physical evidence. Crime scenes yielded little that could be definitively linked to a suspect. The offender's use of gloves and careful handling of objects meant that fingerprints were not available. The absence of identifiable DNA further limited the scope of forensic analysis, particularly given the technological capabilities of the time. Investigators were forced to rely heavily on pattern recognition, witness accounts, and circumstantial connections, all of which, while informative, fell short of providing the level of proof required to identify and apprehend a suspect. One of the central lines of inquiry involved the possibility that the offender had prior knowledge of his victims. The selection of targets suggested more than random choice. The consistency in age range, the focus on specific suburban areas, and the ability to enter homes without immediate detection all pointed toward a degree of premeditation that likely included surveillance. Investigators considered the possibility that the offender observed his victims in advance, learning their routines, identifying moments of vulnerability, and selecting targets based on criteria that only he fully understood. This theory aligned with a broader assessment of his behavior as organized and deliberate. It also introduced a troubling implication, that the crimes may have been preceded by periods of observation during which the offender remained undetected, moving through the same communities without raising suspicion. As the investigation progressed, attention turned to potential suspects who fit elements of the emerging profile. Among those considered was Norman Lee, an individual whose proximity to the areas in question and whose behavior drew investigative interest. At one point, he was regarded as a strong suspect, and resources were directed toward examining his possible connection to the crimes. However, despite the level of suspicion, the case against him did not reach the threshold required for formal charges. The evidence was insufficient to establish a definitive link, and without such proof, the investigation could not proceed to prosecution. This outcome highlighted a recurring challenge. Even when a suspect aligned with aspects of the profile, the absence of concrete evidence prevented the case from advancing. Parallel to this line of inquiry were broader considerations about the offender's background and potential affiliations. The nature of his interactions with victims led some investigators to explore the possibility that he was connected to the education sector. The calm, instructive tone he reportedly used, combined with the age range of his victims, suggested a familiarity with children that could have been developed in a professional context. This theory, like others, remained speculative, grounded in behavioral interpretation rather than direct evidence. It added another dimension to the profile, but did not narrow the field of potential suspects in a way that could be operationalized. Another question that arose during the investigation was whether the crimes could have involved more than one offender. The level of organization, the logistical complexity of the abductions, and the ability to maintain control over extended periods led some to consider the possibility of multiple individuals working together. However, the consistency of the behavior across incidents, particularly in communication and method, supported the prevailing view that a single offender was responsible. The idea of multiple perpetrators was not entirely dismissed, but it remained a secondary consideration, lacking the supporting evidence necessary to challenge the primary hypothesis. The turning point in the investigation came with the 1991 case involving Carmine Shawn. The shift from abduction and release to abduction and murder altered the stakes significantly. For investigators, it introduced a new level of urgency. The possibility that the offender had escalated his behavior raised concerns about future incidents and increased pressure to identify and apprehend him. The introduction of a ransom demand in this case also expanded the scope of the investigation, requiring consideration of financial motives alongside the behavioral patterns established in earlier incidents. Despite this escalation, the fundamental challenges remained. The offender continued to avoid leaving behind usable evidence, and the connection between this case and the earlier incidents, while strongly suspected, did not yield new forensic breakthroughs. The investigation intensified, resources were expanded, and the search for leads continued. But the core obstacle persisted: the absence of a definitive link between the crimes and a specific individual. Throughout this period, the role of Victoria Police was central to the ongoing effort to resolve the case. Investigators worked to synthesize the available information, to identify patterns, and to pursue leads wherever they emerged. The process was methodical, reflecting the same level of structure that characterized the offender's actions. Yet, despite this effort, the case resisted resolution. Each avenue of inquiry led to partial answers, but not to closure. The offender remained unidentified, his actions documented, but his identity concealed. In many ways, the investigation became a pursuit defined by absence of evidence, of certainty, of resolution. It was an effort to reconstruct a series of events from fragments, to build a coherent picture from limited data, and to identify a person who had taken deliberate steps to remain invisible. The term chasing a ghost captures not only the difficulty of the task, but the nature of the subject itself. The offender left behind enough to confirm his existence, to outline his behavior, and to connect his actions across time and place. But he did not leave behind what was needed to find him. And in that gap between what was known and what could be proven, the investigation remained suspended, unresolved, and ongoing. A case without a verdict in most criminal cases, the narrative eventually converges toward a courtroom. Evidence is presented, arguments are tested, and a verdict, however imperfect, offers a form of conclusion. It is within that structured environment that facts are weighed, responsibility is assigned, and a society attempts to formalize its response to harm. But in the case of the offender known as Mr. Cruel, that convergence never occurred. There was no arrest that led to charges, no defendant brought before a judge, no jury asked to deliberate. Instead, the process that typically defines the end of a criminal investigation remained absent, leaving behind a case that exists in a state of unresolved tension between what is known and what cannot be proven. From a legal standpoint, the absence of a trial is not simply a missing chapter. It is a defining characteristic of the case. Without a suspect who can be formally identified and charged, the judicial system cannot engage. The threshold for prosecution requires evidence that can withstand scrutiny in court, evidence that is not only suggestive, but conclusive enough to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In this case, despite the extensive investigative efforts, that threshold was never reached. The pattern of crimes was clear, the connections between incidents strongly supported, and the behavioral profile of the offender well developed. Yet none of these elements, on their own or in combination, provided the level of certainty required to move forward with legal proceedings. The case of Norman Lee illustrates this limitation with particular clarity. At one stage, he was considered a strong suspect, and investigative attention focused on his potential involvement. Factors such as his proximity to the areas where the crimes occurred and aspects of his behavior contributed to this suspicion. In another context, such elements might have been sufficient to justify further legal action. However, suspicion, even when well-founded, is not equivalent to proof. Without direct evidence linking him to the crimes, such as forensic confirmation, credible eyewitness identification, or a confession, the case could not advance to prosecution. The legal system's requirement for certainty serves as a safeguard against wrongful conviction. But in situations like this, it also underscores the difficulty of achieving justice when evidence is limited. As a result, no formal charges were filed, and the possibility of a trial involving this suspect or any other did not materialize. The absence of a trial also meant the absence of a public examination of the evidence. In many cases, the courtroom becomes a space where details are revealed, where the sequence of events is reconstructed in a comprehensive and transparent manner. Witnesses testify, experts provide analysis, and the narrative of the crime is presented in a structured form that allows for scrutiny and debate. In the case of Mr. Cruel, this process never took place. The information gathered during the investigation remained largely within the domain of law enforcement, shared selectively, but never subjected to the full process of judicial review. This lack of public adjudication contributes to the enduring uncertainty surrounding the case. Without a definitive legal conclusion, the narrative remains open-ended, shaped by the available evidence, but not finalized by a formal judgment. For the victims and their families, this absence carries significant emotional weight. The legal process, while often difficult, can provide a sense of acknowledgement, a recognition that what occurred has been formally addressed and that responsibility has been assigned. In this case, that acknowledgement is incomplete. The crimes are recognized, documented, and understood to a significant extent, but the individual responsible remains unidentified. There is no opportunity for direct accountability, no moment in which the offender is confronted within the framework of the law. This absence does not diminish the reality of what happened, but it leaves a gap in the process of resolution, one that cannot be easily filled by investigative conclusions alone. The role of Victoria Police in this context extends beyond the initial investigation. Even without a trial, the case remains active in the sense that it has not been closed. The absence of a suspect does not equate to the absence of effort. Investigators continue to maintain records, review evidence, and consider new information as it becomes available. Advances in forensic technology, changes in investigative techniques, and the possibility of new witness accounts all represent potential avenues through which the case could, in theory, progress. However, these possibilities exist within a framework of uncertainty. The passage of time introduces additional challenges. Memories fade, evidence degrades, and opportunities for new leads become less frequent. Despite these obstacles, the case remains part of the ongoing work of law enforcement. A reminder that the absence of resolution does not eliminate the responsibility to continue seeking it. In the broader context of criminal justice, cases like this highlight the limits of the system. The investigative process can identify patterns, develop profiles, and narrow the field of potential suspects. but without the evidence required to meet legal standards. These efforts cannot culminate in prosecution. This distinction between investigative understanding and legal proof is critical. It reflects the balance that the system seeks to maintain between the pursuit of justice and the protection of individual rights. In some cases, that balance results in outcomes that feel incomplete, where the truth is partially known but not fully established in a legal sense. The Mr. Cruel case exemplifies this tension. It is a case in which the structure of the crimes is understood. The impact on victims is undeniable, and the existence of an offender is certain. Yet the identity of that offender remains unconfirmed. The lack of a verdict also influences how the case is remembered and discussed. Without a definitive conclusion, the narrative remains open to interpretation within the boundaries of the available evidence. Theories persist, suspects are reconsidered, and the details of the investigation continue to be examined from different perspectives. This ongoing analysis reflects both the complexity of the case and the human tendency to seek closure. In the absence of a formal resolution, the process of understanding becomes continuous, extending beyond the original time frame of the investigation and into the present. Ultimately, the outcome of the Mr. Cruel case is defined not by what was decided, but by what was not. There is no verdict to summarize, no sentence to describe, no final statement that brings the narrative to a close. Instead, there's an unresolved question, a gap between the crimes that were committed and the justice that was never formally delivered. This gap does not negate the work that was done or the insights that were gained, but it does shape the legacy of the case. It remains an example of how even the most determined investigative efforts can be constrained by the limits of evidence, and how the absence of a trial can leave a story suspended, without the finality that the legal system is designed to provide. The fear that remained when the sequence of crimes attributed to the offender known as Mr. Cruel came to an apparent halt in the early 1990s. There was no clear moment of resolution for the communities of Melbourne. There was no arrest to mark the end, no public confirmation that the threat had been removed. Instead, what followed was a gradual transition from immediate fear to something more enduring, an awareness that what had happened could not be easily explained, and more importantly, could not be fully contained. The absence of a conclusion shaped the aftermath as much as the crimes themselves. Without a definitive endpoint, the impact did not fade in a linear way. It lingered, evolving into a persistent unease that extended beyond the specific incidents and into the broader understanding of safety within the community. In the years immediately following the final known case, public reaction reflected both relief and uncertainty. The lack of new incidents suggested that the offender was no longer active, at least in the same pattern that had defined the earlier years. But this absence of activity did not equate to reassurance. There is no confirmation that the individual responsible had been identified, apprehended, or prevented from acting again. This uncertainty created a paradoxical environment in which the immediate danger seemed to have receded, yet the underlying risk remained undefined. Parents who had once allowed their children a degree of independence began to reconsider those boundaries. Activities that had been routine, walking to school, playing outside, visiting friends, were viewed through a different lens, one shaped by the knowledge that the threat had originated not in distant or unfamiliar places, but within the home itself. The psychological impact of the case was particularly profound because it challenged one of the most fundamental assumptions of daily life, that the home is a place of safety. The offender's method of entering private residences, controlling entire families, and isolating his victims disrupted that assumption in a way that extended far beyond the individuals directly affected. It introduced a new kind of vulnerability, one that could not be easily mitigated through simple precautions. Locks could be checked, windows secured, routines adjusted. But the awareness that someone had previously bypassed these measures remained. This awareness did not manifest as constant fear, but as a shift in perception, a recognition that safety was not absolute, that it could be compromised by someone with the patience and planning to do so. For the victims and their families, the aftermath was deeply personal and complex. The experiences they endured were not confined to the moments of the crimes themselves, but extended into the years that followed. Recovery, in this context, was not a single process, but a series of adjustments, emotional, psychological, and practical. The presence of unresolved questions added to this complexity. Without a known offender, there was no opportunity for direct confrontation. No possibility of understanding motive beyond what could be inferred from behavior. This absence of answers can be as significant as the presence of trauma, shaping how individuals process what happened and how they integrate those experiences into their lives. The fact that the offender remained unidentified meant that the narrative of the events could not be fully closed, leaving space for uncertainty that might otherwise have been addressed through the legal process. At a broader level, the case became part of the collective memory of the region, a reference point for discussions about crime, safety, and the limits of investigative capability. It stood as an example of how a single individual, operating with precision and restraint, could create widespread impact without leaving behind the evidence typically required for resolution. This aspect of the case contributed to its lasting significance. It was not only the nature of the crimes that made them memorable, but the manner in which they resisted closure. The idea that someone could commit a series of highly controlled offenses, avoid detection, and remain unidentified challenged assumptions about the effectiveness of law enforcement and the reliability of forensic methods, particularly as they existed at the time. The role of Victoria Police in the aftermath reflects an ongoing commitment to addressing that challenge, even without a resolution. The case continues to be maintained within the broader framework of investigative work. Advances in forensic science, changes in investigative techniques, and the potential for new information all represent avenues through which the case could be revisited. This ongoing attention underscores a key aspect of the aftermath. The story is not entirely static. While the events themselves are fixed in time, the interpretation and investigation of those events can evolve. The possibility, however remote, that new evidence could emerge means that the case remains open in a practical sense, even as it occupies a place in historical memory. The legacy of the case also extends into the realm of prevention and awareness. The patterns identified during the investigation, target selection, methods of entry, behavioral characteristics, have contributed to a broader understanding of how certain types of offenders operate. This knowledge, while derived from deeply troubling circumstances, can inform strategies aimed at reducing risk and improving response. In this way, the case has had an indirect impact on how similar incidents are approached, both in terms of investigation and community awareness. It serves as a reminder that understanding behavior, even when it cannot be directly linked to an individual, can still have practical value. Yet, for all the analysis and reflection, the central reality remains unchanged. The identity of the offender is still unknown. This fact shapes every aspect of the case's legacy. It is the reason the narrative does not conclude in the way that many others do. It is the reason the questions persist, revisited over time without definitive answers. Who was he? How did he manage to operate within these communities without being recognized? What factors contributed to the escalation observed in the final case? These questions are not simply academic. They are integral to the way the case is understood and remembered. They represent the gap between what is known and what remains hidden, a gap that has not been closed despite years of investigation and analysis. In reflecting on the case, it is important to maintain focus on the individuals at its center. The victims were not defined by the crimes committed against them, but by the lives they were living before those events and the lives they continued to live afterward. The impact of the case is measured not only in terms of fear or uncertainty, but in the resilience required to move forward in the absence of clear resolution. Their experiences provide the most direct connection to what occurred, grounding the broader narrative in human reality rather than abstraction. The offender, by contrast, remains a figure defined by absence, known through actions, but not through identity. This imbalance is a defining feature of the story. It shifts attention away from the individual who caused harm and toward those who experienced it, reinforcing the importance of understanding the case in terms of its impact rather than its mystery alone. As the years pass, the case of Mr. Cruel continues to occupy a unique position within the history of criminal investigations in Australia. It is remembered not only for the severity of the crimes, but for the way in which it has resisted resolution. It stands as an example of the limits of certainty, of the challenges inherent in identifying an individual who has taken deliberate steps to remain hidden. And it serves as a reminder that the absence of answers does not diminish the significance of what occurred. The events remain, the impact endures, and the questions continue to be asked. In that sense, the story does not end. It remains open, defined not by closure, but by the persistence of uncertainty and the lasting effects of a presence that, for a period of time, moved through ordinary lives without being seen, and then disappeared, leaving behind a silence that has yet to be fully understood. Control, method, and the limits of understanding when examining the case attributed to Mr. Cruel. What emerges most clearly is not a single defining act, but a pattern of behavior that reflects consistency, restraint, and deliberate control. Unlike cases driven by visible escalation from chaos to order, this sequence begins with order. From the earliest known incident in Lower Plenty to the later events in Templestowe, the offender demonstrates an approach that is structured from the outset. This structure is not incidental. It is the foundation upon which every action is built, and it offers one of the few stable points from which analysis can proceed. The first layer of this structure is control over environment. In each incident, the offender enters a private residence, a setting that is inherently unpredictable. A home contains multiple individuals, varying layouts, and potential disruptions. Yet in every known case, he is able to impose order on that environment quickly. Parents are restrained, movement is restricted, and the situation is stabilized within a short period of time. This suggests not only preparation, but an ability to adapt that preparation to different physical spaces. The method of control remains consistent: restraint, threat, and calm communication, but the execution must necessarily adjust to the specifics of each home. That adjustment occurs without visible breakdown, indicating a level of competence that extends beyond theoretical planning into practiced application. The second layer is control over time. The offender does not act impulsively or under visible pressure. In the abduction cases in Ringwood and Donvale, the duration of captivity, approximately 18 to 20 hours, remains within a narrow range. This consistency suggests that the time frame itself is part of the plan, rather than a variable determined by circumstance. Maintaining control over a victim for that length of time without detection requires not only a secure location, but also confidence in the absence of interruption. It implies that the offender has assessed the risks associated with extended captivity and has determined a window within which he can operate safely. This is not an open-ended scenario. It is bounded, measured, and repeated. The repetition of this time frame reinforces the idea that the offender is working within self-imposed parameters, refining a process that he has tested before. The third layer is control over interaction. Victim accounts consistently describe a demeanor that is calm, measured, and at times described as polite. This is not a superficial detail. It plays a functional role in the offender's method. By maintaining a controlled tone, he reduces the likelihood of panic, both in the victims and in the broader environment of the crime. Panic introduces unpredictability, sudden movements, attempts to escape, increased noise, all of which could disrupt the offender's control. A calm voice, by contrast, reinforces authority without escalating tension. It creates a framework in which compliance can be maintained with fewer overt displays of force. This approach aligns with the broader pattern of minimizing variables. The offender is not seeking to dominate through visible aggression, but through consistency and predictability within his own behavior. One of the most difficult aspects of analyzing this case is the presence of seemingly contradictory actions. The provision of food, the allowance for bathing, the provision of clean clothing. These behaviors exist alongside acts that are clearly harmful and coercive. It is important to interpret these actions not as indications of benevolence, but as components of control. They serve practical purposes, maintaining the physical condition of the victim, managing hygiene to reduce trace evidence, and reinforcing a structured environment in which the offender dictates all aspects of the experience. These actions may also contribute to the offender's ability to maintain calm interactions, further stabilizing the situation. When viewed within this framework, the apparent contradiction becomes more coherent. The actions are not inconsistent. They are integrated into a system designed to maintain order and reduce risk. The recording of a victim's voice in the Sharon Wills case introduces an additional layer of complexity. Unlike the other behaviors, which can be directly linked to control and risk management, this action extends beyond immediate necessity. It requires equipment, preparation, and a decision to incorporate an additional element into the process. The purpose of this recording is not defined within the available data, and it remains one of the more ambiguous aspects of the case. However, its presence reinforces the broader conclusion that the offender's actions are not limited to a single objective. They include components that are planned, repeated, and in some cases expanded over time. This expansion suggests a willingness to modify the process, to introduce new elements while maintaining the core structure. The final case, involving Carmine Chon, represents a critical shift in outcome, but it does not entirely disrupt the underlying pattern. The initial stages, entry into the home, removal of the victim, control of the situation, remain consistent with earlier incidents. The introduction of a ransom demand marks a divergence, adding a new dimension to the offender's actions. Whether this reflects a change in motive or an adaptation of method cannot be determined definitively from the available data. What can be observed is that the outcome differs significantly from previous cases. The victim is not released, and the sequence concludes with her death. This escalation raises important questions about the stability of the offender's self-imposed parameters. For several years, the pattern included a defined endpoint, the release of the victim. In this instance, that endpoint is absent. The reasons for this change remain unclear, but its presence indicates that the structure, while consistent, is not immutable. It can shift, and when it does, the consequences are more severe. From an investigative perspective, the case highlights the limitations of relying on patterns without corresponding physical evidence. The behavioral consistency provides a strong basis for linking incidents and constructing a profile, but it does not identify the individual responsible. The lack of forensic evidence, no clear DNA, no fingerprints, no identifiable traces, creates a gap that behavioral analysis alone cannot fill. This gap is central to understanding why the case remains unresolved. The offender's awareness of investigative methods, combined with his disciplined execution, effectively reduces the available avenues for identification. Each crime scene offers confirmation of his actions, but not of his identity. The consideration of suspects, such as Norman Lee, illustrates the difficulty of moving from suspicion to proof. Even when an individual aligns with elements of the profile, geographic proximity, behavioral indicators, this alignment is not sufficient to meet the standards required for legal action. The absence of direct evidence prevents the transition from investigative theory to prosecutable case. This distinction underscores a broader principle within criminal investigation. Patterns can guide inquiry, but they cannot replace evidence. The case also raises questions about pre-offense behavior, particularly in relation to surveillance. The selection of victims, the timing of the incidents, and the ability to enter homes without immediate detection all suggest that the offender may have observed his targets in advance. This observation would allow for the identification of routines, the assessment of risk, and the selection of optimal moments for entry. While the specifics of this process are not documented, the consistency of the outcomes supports the conclusion that such preparation is likely. This introduces an additional layer of concern, as it implies that the crimes were preceded by periods of undetected activity within the same communities. The offender was not only present during the incidents themselves, but potentially during the time leading up to them, moving without drawing attention. In the broader context of criminal behavior, the case exemplifies a model of organized offending in which control, planning, and restraint are central. It challenges assumptions that equate severity with chaos, demonstrating that highly structured behavior can produce outcomes that are both effective in avoiding detection and deeply harmful. It also highlights the limits of existing systems when confronted with an individual who operates within those limits, anticipating and countering the methods used to identify him. The result is a case that is well documented in terms of events, but incomplete in terms of resolution. Ultimately, the extended analysis returns to the same central tension that defines the case as a whole. There is a clear pattern, a consistent method, and a set of behaviors that can be described and understood to a significant degree. But there is no identity to attach to that pattern, no definitive answer to the question of who carried it out. This absence does not diminish the value of the analysis, but it does define its limits. It allows for understanding, but not for closure. And in that space between knowledge and resolution, the case continues to exist, structured, consistent, and unresolved. Silence, control, and the unanswered questions in examining the full arc of the case attributed to Mr. Cruel. What remains most striking is not only the sequence of crimes themselves, but the enduring absence that surrounds them. The events that took place between 1987 and 1991 across the suburbs of Melbourne are, in many respects, clearly defined. There is a pattern of entry, a method of control, a consistency in victim profile, and a progression that culminates in a single fatal outcome. These elements form a structure that can be studied, compared, and understood within the limits of available information. And yet, despite this clarity, the central figure of the case remains undefined. There is no confirmed identity, no definitive narrative of who the offender was beyond the actions he carried out. This tension between what is known and what is not known is the foundation upon which the case continues to rest. One of the most persistent themes that emerges from this case is the concept of silence. Not silence in the literal sense alone, though that is certainly present in the nighttime settings of the crimes, but a broader silence defined by absence of evidence, of witnesses, of resolution. The offender operated within this silence, using it not as a backdrop, but as a tool. His actions did not draw attention in the way that more chaotic crimes might. They were contained, controlled, and executed in a manner that minimized disruption beyond the immediate environment. This containment allowed him to move through multiple incidents without being identified, to leave behind scenes that confirmed his presence but revealed little about his identity. In this sense, silence becomes an active element of the case, shaping both the crimes and the investigation that followed. Closely connected to this is the theme of control, which extends beyond the physical actions of the offender into the structure of the entire sequence. Control is evident in the way he entered homes, in the way he managed multiple individuals, and in the way he maintained consistency across incidents. It is also evident in the boundaries he appeared to set for himself, time frames of captivity, methods of interaction, and, for a period of time, the decision to release victims rather than to escalate to lethal outcomes. This self-imposed structure suggests a framework within which he operated, one that was stable enough to be repeated but flexible enough to accommodate changes when necessary. The eventual shift in the case involving Carmine Chon demonstrates that this framework was not fixed. It could be altered, and when it was, the consequences were significant. The presence of such control complicates the way the case is interpreted. It resists simple explanations and requires a more nuanced understanding of how structured behavior can produce unpredictable outcomes. Another theme that runs through the case is the limitation of systems designed to provide answers. The investigation conducted by Victoria Police reflects a methodical and sustained effort to identify the offender. Patterns were recognized, profiles were developed, and potential suspects were examined. Yet, despite these efforts, the case did not progress to a point where legal action could be taken. This outcome highlights the distinction between understanding and proof. It is possible to understand the structure of a series of crimes, to identify the behaviors that define them, and to narrow the field of potential suspects, without reaching the level of certainty required for prosecution. This distinction is not a failure of the system, but a reflection of its constraints. The standards that protect against wrongful conviction also set a high threshold for establishing guilt. And in cases where evidence is limited, that threshold may not be met. The result is a situation in which the truth, while partially visible, remains incomplete in a legal sense. The role of memory and time further shapes the way the case is perceived. As years pass, the immediacy of the events diminishes, but their significance does not. Instead, the case transitions from a current investigation to a historical reference point, one that is revisited in discussions about unsolved crimes and investigative challenges. This transition does not resolve the underlying questions, but it changes the context in which they are asked. The focus shifts from immediate action to reflection, from urgency to analysis. Yet even within this more distant perspective, the core uncertainties remain. The identity of the offender is still unknown. The reasons for certain actions, such as the recording of a victim's voice in the case of Sharon Wills, are still not fully understood. And the factors that led to the escalation in the final case are still open to interpretation. These unresolved elements ensure that the case does not settle into a fixed narrative. It remains dynamic, subject to ongoing consideration and reinterpretation. At the center of all these themes are the individuals who experience the crimes. The victims represent the most direct connection to what occurred, and their experiences anchor the case in reality. While the broader analysis may focus on patterns, methods, and systems, it is essential to maintain awareness of the human impact that underlies these discussions. The disruption of safety, the experience of isolation within one's own home, and the long-term effects of such events are not abstract concepts. They are lived realities that extend beyond the time frame of the incidents themselves. In this context, the absence of resolution takes on additional significance. It is not only a gap in the investigative process, but a factor that influences how those experiences are integrated and understood over time. The inability to identify the offender means that certain questions remain unanswered, and that absence can shape the process of recovery in ways that are difficult to quantify. As a concluding reflection, the case of Mr. Cruel can be understood as an intersection of clarity and ambiguity. The clarity lies in the documented events, the sequence of incidents, the consistency of method, the identifiable pattern that links them together. The ambiguity lies in the absence of identity, the lack of definitive answers to key questions, and the inability to bring the case to a formal conclusion. These two elements coexist, creating a narrative that is both detailed and incomplete. It is a case that can be studied extensively, analyzed from multiple perspectives, and understood in terms of its structure and impact, yet still remain unresolved at its core. In the end, what persists is not only the memory of what happened, but the awareness of what is still unknown. The offender moved through a series of controlled actions, leaving behind evidence of behavior, but not of identity. The investigation followed, reconstructing those actions as thoroughly as possible, yet unable to bridge the final gap. And the communities affected were left to reconcile both the events themselves and the absence of closure that followed. This combination of presence and absence, of knowledge and uncertainty, is what defines the lasting significance of the case. It is not only a story of crimes committed, but a study in the limits of understanding, and a reminder that some questions, even when carefully examined, may remain unanswered.